Hey everyone, my name is Kathleen Juell, and I'm a developer at DigitalOcean. I work on the DODX digital experience team, which is the team that powers our DigitalOcean's web properties, such as our www site and community, among other things. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about teaching and learning Kubernetes. This talk is being recorded, so you can catch it again either here or on the DigitalOcean YouTube channel or DigitalOcean community at do.co/tech-talks. So I'm hoping to engage in some questions, but I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and we will be answering them live. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with the community platform already. We have a wide range of tutorials, questions, answers, and developer tools that are designed to spread awareness and knowledge of open source technologies. I just want to say a quick word too before I go any further about our community writing program, Write for Donations. If any of you have anything that you want to share with our community, I would urge you to apply. I'd also be happy to answer any questions about that process myself. It's a great way to engage with community and share what you know. Okay, so why am I here today? I want to take you today through some of the lessons that the community team has learned from both a content and a development perspective about effective Kubernetes onboarding. The goal is to give you some actionable tips that you can hopefully use the next time you need to get yourself or your team up to speed with Kubernetes. So how did we come to these insights? As many of you are aware, DigitalOcean has a managed Kubernetes product which was made generally available in May of 2019. So leading up to and following the release of that product, the core contributors on the community content team were tasked with the following project: teach the world Kubernetes. So the push to develop content began. And here in this screenshot, you can see one outgrowth of the push for content, which is our Kubernetes for full stack developers curriculum, which I'm going to discuss in more detail later. So teach the world Kubernetes seems like a straightforward ask, right? Except where do you even begin? The content team was definitely going to need some operating and orienting principles. Otherwise, and I definitely would not recommend this approach, the team would just be creating content using a kind of scattershot approach, hoping to cover all relevant bases by some kind of happy accident. So I'm going to cut right to the chase and tell you about the approach that the team used and the principles that they came up with to teach the world Kubernetes. So first thing, know your audience and their objectives. Second, determine the best approach to meet those objectives. And then finally, scope your approach appropriately. And I'll have more to say about each of these in turn. Meanwhile, back on the community platform itself, there were a set of related questions and issues arising. Basically, we are in the process of moving our staging and production pipelines and environments to our internal Kubernetes clusters. Prior to this transition, we have been relying on some trusty, reliable, but ultimately outdated Ubuntu servers. Like the 97 Corolla that I drove until a few years ago, these servers had brought us far, but it was time to make a change. So the principles that I want to discuss today for onboarding teams and individuals to Kubernetes also stem from the work that the development team was doing on the platform side. Community is a Rails application, and it was staffed by a group of developers with web development backgrounds who are used to deploying in a more traditional VM environment. So deploying to Kubernetes meant involving the entire team in decision-making conversations around the changes, consequences and trade-offs of using this new architecture. In talking about these principles today, I'm going to combine insights from both the content and the development side, as I had the good fortune of both contributing content to our Kubernetes curriculum and working on the development team that finalized community's transition to Kubernetes. So first, when you're getting anyone up to speed with Kubernetes, or really any other topic, the first question that you want to ask is, who are you dealing with? Maybe you're primarily talking to developers. So this group wants to be able to accomplish their day-to-day tasks and deliver on any set expectations. To do this, they need to know enough about how their application environment will change in order to make the best and most informed decisions. One example out of many would be something like a cron job. Cron jobs work one way on a VM, but in a distributed environment, they need to be handled differently. So it's good for whoever is working on features that expect those jobs to be running to be informed about any relevant changes. Members of this group also need to be able to deploy. Or if they're not doing that themselves, they need to be able to get things up to a point where deployment can happen. For our team, deployment on Kubernetes would involve different processes from what we have been using on VMs, so no more Capybara, for example. Thus, we needed to bring people up to speed on how moving to Kubernetes would affect the deploy process. So maybe you're onboarding operators, or maybe your audience includes people who will function in this role. Like developers, this group will need to know the processes, procedures, and tools that relate to deployment. However, they will also likely be charged with things like automation, managing CI, scheduling backups, and other related tasks. Additionally, they will likely be asked to implement logging, monitoring, and alerting. So the information that's tailored for this group will likely cover somewhat different topics than the information that's being tailored for application developers. Another possibility is maybe you're onboarding business decision makers or other stakeholders. These could be the folks, for example, who are in the position to approve the additional headcount that you need to accelerate your development on Kubernetes. So information for this group will be tailored around things like making financial decisions and really understanding the tech as it rolls up to those top-level business goals. They also need to see how and where team growth and development fit into the longer-term objectives for the business. Okay, so with these ideas in mind, let's go back to the Kubernetes curriculum. Thinking about these groups, as I've just described them, ended up being central to how the content team organized content, which consisted of new tutorials that were written for this curriculum specifically, as well as existing content that the team wanted to organize and present in a new and meaningful way. At first, the team considered using different tracks that geared material only towards members of specific groups. But ultimately, they ended up taking a slightly different choose-your-own-adventure style of approach. Materials were organized in such a way that users could select what was most relevant to them at that point in time. And though they didn't end up including this in the curriculum itself, the team did publish a white paper that was addressed specifically to business stakeholders to provide a kind of bird's eye view of Kubernetes and its benefits. Okay, so once you know who it is that you're addressing, who's your audience, the next thing you want to think about is your approach. Excuse me, what approach are you taking to onboarding this group? If your audience includes application developers who need to develop with a distributed architecture and deploy successfully, then you might consider covering the following topics as a way of establishing some theoretical foundations and covering what's needed to accomplish practical tasks. So first, you might want to touch on 12 FA principles for things like versioning, dependencies, configuration, state, and so on. Environment variables are a great example here, making sure that everyone knows what they need to refactor and who holds the keys for updating those variables wherever they're going to live. So in our case, that's in Vault, but you could be using a different secrets manager. It also might be good to cover some modernizing topics, things like health and readiness checks, logging, monitoring. Even in cases where logging and monitoring are handled by other teams ultimately, application developers could still be responsible for things like making sure health and/or readiness endpoints exist. Next, containers. What do they mean for your application? One way of covering this in practical terms could be setting up a local development environment with Docker and Compose, which will get folks familiar with what goes into an image and how the containerized stack behaves as a whole. So for example, Community sits behind Nginx. Having a local setup that replicated the deployed stack was really crucial for illustrating what was coming and also getting the team comfortable with the entire setup and transition. Finally, you want to make sure that whoever is deploying knows what's required for that process to be successful. So who is pressing the button, what button needs to be pressed, and what should folks do in case of failures or necessary rollbacks. So while it might seem straightforward to say that you're just going to cover these topics, blockers might arise for your team as they process this information and look at what's required of them to get up to speed with the proposed changes. Ostensibly, your team is spending hours of work on this transition, so you want to help them avoid any potential blockers. One blocker, for example, might come to be something like, why are these changes necessary? Why do we need to think about or implement 12 FA principles? Another might be, what's a distributed architecture? What are some of the basic components of that in our case? Another blocker could potentially be, how do containers differ from VMs? Like, what does the developer need to know to be successful in a containerized environment? And then finally, for the deployment process, what brass tacks, what is changing from the tools and systems that I'm used to if I have to deploy into this new environment? So depending on where your developers are coming from and what their experiences are, it may be helpful to actually think about taking a step back and covering some meta-level topics during your onboarding process. Ultimately, this has the benefit of involving the team more closely in the decision-making process, since a meta-level understanding will allow them to extrapolate out and get ahead of problems that could arise in their own domains of expertise. So one helpful approach to doing this, to kind of taking a meta-level approach in addition to a more practical or tactile approach, would be to separate out some larger topics, like what is Kubernetes? What are containers? What are the components of a distributed architecture in our case? From operational topics like, how do I extract my application configuration? And how do I ensure that my app is stateless? Again, it's really important to understand the exact needs of your group and what they have experience with, as well as what they are trying to accomplish when you think about exactly how you're going to break these topics out. In the Kubernetes curriculum, for example, the content team decided to address the need for a meta-level overview by having an introductory topics section that readers could opt into if they wanted. So this section covered things like basic system architecture, core objects, and other key foundational concepts. Since the audience for the curriculum was theoretically everyone, this seemed to make the most sense. The team assumed that this information would be helpful for many people, but that it wasn't necessary reading for everyone. So it made sense to include it as optional and for anyone who wanted a refresher. Meanwhile, back on the community platform team, we were giving regular updates about our progress as we conducted testing for our production rollover, though we did break some of the decision-making discussions into smaller stand-ups for the core folks who were involved on the infrastructure side. We also created some internal documentation to give a kind of high-level overview of where information was now going to be located in the application, so things like deployment manifests and pipelines for concourse. We also created some detailed guides on how to deploy to staging and production and how to roll back and redeploy. Overall, I would say we were taking a pretty operational approach to information sharing. Some of the topics that we wanted to make sure everyone understood and was good on before we moved towards the final rollover included understanding where secrets are located, understanding some of the basics of what were in our key images, how to troubleshoot concourse, and then of course how to kick off and roll back deployments. However, it turns out that we hadn't actually taken the time to cover some of those meta level topics that I was just discussing. So some of those topics and some of the implications of what it meant to deploy in a distributed environment weren't on the table from the get-go. So we saw this most clearly in how conversations around scheduled jobs were evolving, which changed over the course of the road to this rollover as we talked about the anticipated architecture. So once everybody was on the same page with the kind of higher level structure of what we were doing, we were then able to come up with a solution to ensure that scheduled jobs ran as expected between our two clusters. Some of the key learnings that we took away from this were that it's okay to break folks out in terms of operational responsibilities, like having a dedicated group that is dealing with infrastructure in a granular way. And it's also totally fine to organize information dissemination around operational goals like app development, deployment, and so on. But it's also a really good idea to sync on meta level changes to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And in retrospect, I guess I would recommend doing that at the beginning of a big transition process rather than in the middle or something like that. Okay, so the last topic I want to touch on is scope. Once you know who you are dealing with and what their objectives are, as well as the approach that you're going to take to meeting those objectives, either a meta level approach or an operational one or some kind of combination of the two, then you need to think about how you're going to scope the communication process. So there are a number of different formats that you can consider. Documentation, for example, is a great way of communicating information asynchronously. The documentation also offers the added benefit of creating self-selecting pathways through a body of material. That can be handy if you have a lot of stuff to cover, or if you have a wide audience and you're not quite sure what people's experience levels are. For example, the Kubernetes curriculum, which I've been recurring to, offered a topical and self-selecting path through a lot of different materials. And as I've mentioned, each of the clusters of tutorials in the sections of the curriculum rolled up to a particular audience, so developers, operators, with topics that pertain to the goals that those users might have in mind. Similarly, I would say the Kubernetes docs offer a great and self-selecting pathway, right, where users can find information on core concepts, as well as information on particular operational tasks. Also, another way that you can incrementally expand the scope of your documentation without changing your approach substantially. So let's say you're trying to talk about, you're doing a tutorial on an operational task, but you want to get some meta level content in there, is what I like to think of as a unique feature of DigitalOcean's technical tutorials. So DigitalOcean's tutorials often include small, positive phrase level explanations of particular tools, technologies, and concepts. These are relatively cheap to include in terms of the space and effort required, but they can really integrate some meta level coverage into what would otherwise be operational topics. So basically, a good rule of thumb is when in doubt, define. Go ahead and define it. If somebody already knows it, they can skip it. If they don't, though, it's going to be super helpful. Another great format for onboarding folks is a recorded talk. At DigitalOcean, for example, we do a Munch and Learn series, which happens every Wednesday, which has in the past covered topics like Ceph 101, writing Kubernetes controllers, and concourse best practices, and more. So these are an awesome way to scope a topic down and really focus it on developers and operators. They're also an invaluable resource to help foster company-wide best practices and common patterns. And finally, I don't really want to suggest adding meetings to anyone's calendar, but if you approach them strategically, they can be a great time saver. Speaking from our experience on community, it's particularly helpful to approach meetings if you have an agenda, particularly if you are getting people acquainted with Kubernetes for the first time. So even a few minutes at the top of a meeting, that's kind of a kickoff meeting, that is doing a high-level architectural overview or a refresher on Kubernetes core concepts and objects, that can save you time down the road and can undergird really the rest of your discussions in a meaningful way. Also, your approach to onboarding doesn't have to be only one of these formats, right? In general, I would say that your scope is going to narrow as you move through these different formats, right? Documentation tends to anticipate a wider audience by virtue of persistence over time. Talks vary, of course, but in the quick kind of half-hour Munch and Learn format that I've described, the scope will be somewhat narrow because it's covering a set topic for an audience that can be somewhat anticipated. Finally, in a meeting, you're going to be speaking to a very narrow audience. Ostensibly, these are your teammates and colleagues, and you share common context as well as perhaps common experiences. So you can actually, in that format, safely make lots of assumptions about the background that folks are bringing to that discussion in a way that will help kind of make it the most efficient discussion possible. So on community, I would say we took a kind of composite approach by combining focus meetings and internal documentation with some video resource sharing, so some of those Munch and Learns that I mentioned earlier. We also created a local Docker environment to look at how our stack was behaving locally. In retrospect and overall, I would say the team has adapted really well to the changed environment. Everyone knows what they need to do to get their jobs done. And honestly, people feel really positively about the move to Kubernetes, since for an application that serves about 4 million unique visitors a month, Kubernetes definitely gives us security in scale, among other things. So, in this process, did we make everybody a Kubernetes power user? No, but in our case, that wasn't the need. Instead, we wanted to empower our team to do their best work and extend their knowledge of our architecture through the other decisions that they needed to make, while also ensuring that they were able to meet their goals and expectations.